What I'm going to share with you in these next few moments is a picture of King that America has neglected. And I believe you're going to be startled by what you learn, but that's important in effective pedagogy. The term is called cognitive dissonance. You have to shake you up, disrupt this image you have, this image we have of Dr. King that lacks appropriate complexity and nuance. And so on the flyer that we promoted across the city, we gave the tagline, why Dr. King said his dream became a nightmare. But I want to focus our attention this morning on this idea of the dream turned nightmare, expanding and complexifying our understanding of King. As you walk through the door, you probably saw an edition of a magazine that was published last year. It's called Virginia Capital Connections Quarterly. In this magazine, I wrote an article entitled The Unknown King, based on work that I was doing, teaching a class on Dr. King, and really lifting up the fact that as popular, as prominent as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is in America, he is really unknown.
That's right.
There are two quotes that I wanted to lift up. The first is, says, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the unknown king. He has been caricatured as a dreamer by politicians and mainstream Americans who want convenient quotes that have the potential to inspire good feelings on King Day. And that's really how King gets used.
Yes.
Anytime someone wants to sound like they're on the right side, they will find a book that King wrote and get a quote and quote Dr. King, and it just gives them political, sometimes spiritual, and moral currency in America. It's a very interesting thing. But they really don't understand the substance of his thinking. Another quote is, for the past 5 decades, this country, we've tried to honor Dr. King. Yes, we want to honor him. There's a monument in Washington, D.C. Who's been to that monument? It's moving. You go to the monument and his quotes are everywhere in a country that, again, does not really understand the substance of his thinking. And so really what we've done, and this is a particular term that comes out of the religious community, is we have given what we call lip service to Dr. King. And that's what we've done as a country instead of really understanding what he stood for. So to me, there are two problems that I see with King's legacy in this country. The first problem is we don't understand the original context that really gives substance and meaning to King's ideas. See, it's one thing to just grab a quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When did he say that? What was going on historically? People they're completely oblivious to, in particular, the connections of King's thought to black issues. King gets lifted out of the historical context. The effects of slavery, Jim Crow, sharecropping, convict leasing, all of that gets ignored. King becomes this figure. And while we do appreciate that the country wants to honor him, I'm not saying we shouldn't honor him and appreciate him, we should. But we have to do so by also honoring the context that gave rise to his leadership and his ideas. Which takes me to my second problem, is we don't treat King like an intellectual. That our way of taking his ideas out of context, ignoring the fact that he has a PhD, ignoring the fact that this is just a sample of his writings. Someone who put so much thought behind protests, marches. I mean a tremendous amount of thought. This man is an intellectual. And so if you want to honor King, you have to understand who he is, what he stood for. What do some of these concepts like nonviolence? How did he understand that? Why did he oppose the Vietnam War? Oh, because he was a pacifist. Not really. Yes, but there was a lot more there. And you have to study King's thought. You have to respect him as an intellectual. I just don't see other intellectuals having their ideas lifted out of context and used as widely as King's. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways I think we dishonor King is by minimizing the complexity and the depth of his thought. There should be courses on Martin Luther King Jr. taught at every university and college in this country. Who's had a full-length academic course on King? Exactly. But there are other white intellectuals you get a full course on. Okay. But here on this campus, it's one of the wonderful things about an HBCU. On Tuesday nights, there is a class on this campus studying King as an intellectual. And I'm teaching that class. And it is open to both undergraduate and graduate students. We even have members of the community who are in that class. Because King was more than just a minister, more than just an activist. He was an intellectual. And so King has really become this caricature. When Reagan, of course, signed the bill where we're gonna, celebrate King Day, look at this quote. Traces of bigotry still mar America. So each year on MLK Day, let us not only recall Dr. King, but rededicate ourselves to the commandments he believed in and sought to live every day. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's his take on King's legacy. Now, what is that? That's a quote from Jesus, that's coming out of Luke. Yeah. Okay, and does that resonate with some of what King believed in? Yes. But is that really the substance of King's thought? Absolutely not. And most political leaders, and I'm going to be honest, most religious leaders, when they use King, this is about the extent, this is about the level of depth they can get to. Because they probably haven't read anything King wrote from beginning to end. But they've gotten one of those books, and as a biblical scholar, this is one of the things I hate, these Bible promise books, where you get these and they take these scriptures out of context. If you want a scripture for hope, if you want a scripture for love. As a scholar, we're like, no, these ideas are in passages. Passages you have to pay attention to, issues of context. We do the exact same thing with King's legacy, even when we're trying to do something good. But someone foresaw this as far back as '69. Look at this poem. It says, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. Build monuments to his glory. Sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes. They cannot rise to challenge images we would fashion from their lives. And besides, it is easier to build monuments than to make a better world. So now that he is safely dead, we, with ease consciousness, will teach our children that he was a great man, knowing that the cause for which he lived is still a cause, and the dream for which he died is still a dream. A dead man's dream. So Carl Wendell Himes, he saw that this was going to happen. And did this happen? Yes. This is exactly what happened. While he was alive, particularly those last years, King was hated.
Hated, man.
Okay, he was hated. Okay, he was getting pushback like you would not believe from the white community. And he was also getting significant pushback even within the black community. But once he died, all of that began to change. And now today, what do we say about King? Even people who would oppose King's beliefs, oh, he was a great man. We should all strive to be like Dr. King. As if that is what it means to honor him. So what I want to give attention to on this morning is this caricature of King as just a dreamer. Because this is one of our sort of dominant meta-narratives about Martin Luther King Jr. Oh, what did Dr. King stand for? Oh, he was a dreamer. He had a dream for all of America. So let's try to think about, okay, if the dream is this important, then let's try to understand the dream in context. Because what King said in 63, he is going to reverse in 67.
Come on, man.
And you're going to find that it's very interesting that this shift King had in his thinking has completely dropped out of our national consciousness. On this day and for about 28 days next month, you're probably going to hear folks talking about King and his dream. So what was going on that led up to King giving this speech? Well, of course, we know a lot was happening in 1963 that's completely dropped from the national consciousness. For example, NAACP, they had a national campaign, and their motto was free by 63. What does free by 63? What that was lifting up was 100 years after Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were still fighting for their freedom. So when we're talking about the March on Washington and King's speech, again, that context gets completely left off. That here, 100 years after Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks are still organizing, pushing, and fighting for freedom. There are demonstrations all over the South. King and members of the SCLC, they're working in Birmingham. And look what they're demanding 100 years after slavery was over. Employment opportunities, desegregation of public facilities, a plan to desegregate. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on that, but I think we even misunderstand King's vision of desegregation. We completely really miss what King meant by that. As well as dropping all of the charges. 2,500 people were arrested for demonstrations. So when we're talking about what it is that gave rise to the speech, who's talking about police brutality? Who's talking about policing? Is policing still a problem today? Yes, it's still a problem. So when we try to honor the legacy of King, how about let's understanding what was happening then? Because there's probably going to be some continuity between some of these same things King was dealing with and some of the same things we're dealing with today. But that gets completely left off. Oh, there was this march. Look at this. I mean, look at the scene. Look at that imagery. Over 200,000 blacks and whites marched on Washington. And when it's taught in public schools, what label and name do they give for this march? They call it the March on Washington. What was King's understanding of it? Jobs and freedom. But that got left off. So when we think about the March on Washington, we're not thinking about black people want to work. There are some structural problems with this country. So they don't even understand the historical context that gave rise to this massive movement in August of 28. And of course it is here where King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Now this is why it's so good that I am both an exegete as well as a black religious scholar. Because what I've learned is literary analysis, how to pay attention to text and to pay attention to words. Because there's a lot about even this speech. It's very interesting. So it's interesting to pay attention to the parts of the speech that we have just forgotten about. And the part, so notice parts, plural, versus the part that we remember. Let me just give you some samples of the parts we have forgotten just about that speech. King says, right in line with the work that was going on in 63, 100 years later, 100 years after emancipation, okay, 98 since the end of the Civil War, things are not much better for black Americans. But this is the part of the speech that gets left off. He says the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. He is painting a very vivid picture that 100 years after slavery, things are not that much better for the masses of black Americans.
Thank you, sir.
And that's right at the outset. But do you hear that clip played on King Day?
No.
Exactly. Do you hear that clip played during Black History Month?
No.
No. Let me give you a couple more. He says, in a sense, we've come to cash a check. Okay. That gets left off, where he talks about that black people have been given a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. Now, you know, maybe some of these millennials don't necessarily like a check, you know, insufficient funds. But some of us folks with some gray, if you write a check and there's not money in the bank to cover it, the bank they would mail that check back and it'll have a big stamp on it, usually in red, saying insufficient funds. So in other words, the bank's not gonna honor that check. And so King is talking about issues of economics, structural inequality. He gets deeper into the speech and he says we can never be satisfied as long as we're the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Wow, that gets left off. Okay, that a part of the system of slavery and segregation, policing in this country has always been tied to these systems. And issues that we have with policing today, they're very much a part of that context, and the reason we can't get anywhere is because we keep ignoring these core, deeper issues. So he says we can't be satisfied. Do you know how many times during the Montgomery bus boycott, King was arrested, harassed by the police? You ought to look that up. And if you take my King class, you're gonna learn about that. But I'm not gonna tell you. I'm just gonna tell you, it was a lot. All the time he was being harassed, arrested by the cops. Okay. He says we can't be satisfied as long as our body's heavy with fatigue of travel. We can't gain lodging in the motels of the highways, the hotels of the cities. Can't be satisfied as long as our basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. In other words, he's talking about deeper structural issues. He said we can't accept this. And he's talking about that in Washington, before the nation, before the world. But here's the part we love, okay? So he says, and even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. Yeah. Now, in black preaching,
come on, man.
Okay, in black preaching, there's always the problem that sometimes the close is so good that it causes people to miss the substance of the message. That they leave church, all they're talking about, oh, man, woo, he closed that sermon. He got to the end and started talking about it, and then all the teaching points, all the substance of the sermon is completely ignored. King is a black preacher. He's standing in that black preaching tradition. So King is going to give the nation a close. But what that close, it was so effective, it was so powerful that it caused so many just to completely forget everything else and to focus on this. And he says he has a dream that's deeply rooted in the American dream, that of course one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. Here's a very Christian vision as he gets a little further down, where he talks about the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. The New Testament term for that is koinonia. It's experiencing fellowship in a profound and a deep way. And he's really lifting up this biblical vision of brotherhood and sisterhood. He says, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. Yeah. And that has become the sum total of our understanding of King. You see, he was a dreamer, and that's beautiful. But all those other parts are ignored. But here's the worst part of it. Well, the world, of course, celebrates King, so Time makes him the Man of the Year. The next year in '64, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. An amazing accomplishment. But in '64, they passed the Civil Rights Act, and all hell broke loose in this country. 1 year after he gave that speech, the country took one step forward and passed the Civil Rights Act. Passed it in July. And what happened? We had what's called the long, hot summer of '64 and widespread, rampant white backlash. Okay? So as the country tried to take a step forward and to live into this vision, blacks got a lot of pushback. Violence broke out in cities everywhere. Many blacks were killed during protests and demonstrations. The Klan sort of reasserted themselves, began to gain positions of leadership in the country. Pickets, protests in white businesses. If white business people were doing business with blacks, they were accosted, called nigger lovers. There was mob violence, and black people being killed. Now, and I'll try to touch on this toward the end of the presentation. But in America, the life equation is very skewed. Like, for example, think the way we talk about war today. We go wage war in places like Afghanistan, Iraq. We kill masses of brown people there, and we don't even count them. But they can tell you 650 Americans have been killed over there. Yeah. There's something wrong with that when we're only counting certain people, but then all the other people who are dying, we're not counting them. So I do want to pause when what historians do when they talk about many times blacks were killed during protests and demonstrations. We don't even know the numbers. We just know they were killed. And we know a lot of times in this country, when black people are killed, it doesn't matter. But if you fly a plane into the Twin Towers, we will read the names of those people. We will honor their humanity. And I'm not saying it's wrong to do that, but I'm saying you should do it for everyone.
Yes.
But all lives matter. I digress. Between June and October, you're having churches being bombed in Mississippi. 24 churches being partially burned, destroyed. And of course, in September, you have 4 girls killed with the 16th Street Baptist, the bombing there at the church in Alabama. And then, of course, continuing with intimidation with voting. Now, notice I say in the heading, King in America, Wake from the Dream. Here's why I put in bold the church bombing in Alabama. Because I'm going to do a little inversion. A few months before King was assassinated, he was preaching in Ebenezer on Christmas Eve. And he made a very powerful admission that a year after he gave that speech, something was already churning. Look what he says. He said, I must confess to you today that not long after talking about that dream, I started seeing it turn into a nightmare. I remember the first time I saw that dream turn into a nightmare, just a few weeks after I had talked about it. It was when 4 beautiful, unoffending, innocent Negro girls were murdered in a church in Birmingham, Alabama. Notice he says, I started seeing it turn into a night. That means it's a process. He starts wrestling with some things. And that bombing disrupted his vision of this country. And he's going to grapple with this for about 4 years, which then takes me to what he tells the nation in an NBC News interview.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments, and I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation. I'm not going to say that all of our problems will be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended, but I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems. When a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, it loses its social perspective, and programs of social uplift suffer. This is just a fact of history, so that we do face many more difficulties as a result of the war. It's much more difficult to really arouse a conscience during a time of war. There is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. It didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something. I feel that nonviolence is really the only way that we can follow, because violence is just so self-defeating. A riot ends up creating many more problems for the Negro community than it solves. You can, through violence, burn down a building, but you can't establish justice. You can murder a murderer, but you can't murder through violence. You can murder a hater, but you can't murder hate. And what we are trying to get rid of is hate and injustice and all of these other things that continue the long night of man's inhumanity to man.
When we allow freedom reign, when we let it reign from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
How many of you knew that King said his dream became a nightmare? I never knew that.
Okay.
I never heard that. Then here I'm teaching this class and I come across this clip and I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, wait a minute. His dream speech, I mean, that's our sort of understanding of what King stood for. But King said his dream has become a nightmare. I think there are 4 things he says that I want to really give some attention to. The first is, of course, the statement where he says, I must confess that the dream that I had has turned into a nightmare. Look at the language he uses here. Talking about soul-searching and agonizing moments, which goes back to the bombing in Birmingham. He's been wrestling with this for years. So this is not some sort of flippant statement, the way we just sort of get in a moment and we just say, I think this sounds provocative. My dream's a nightmare, just for the ratings. No, he grappled with this. Look at the statement where he says, some of the old optimism was a little superficial. What is that a reference to? That is a reference to the close of the I Have a Dream speech. He looks at that and he says that was a little superficial. Wait a minute. I mean, that's our image of King. And he later looked back to say that wasn't maybe the most realistic thing to say. Right. In that moment, that's what I thought, that's what I felt. But he says, and he reiterates this point, we have many more difficult days ahead. All right, say that with me. Many more difficult days ahead. That's King accepting America for what it is. And then, of course, this gives substance to his opposition to the Vietnam War, not just because he's a pacifist, but because when you have a nation that wants to build the military-industrial complex, they're going to do it on the backs of the poor. So instead of investing in social programs that's going to lift the poor, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars going to wage war in other parts of the world where brown and black people live. And then when it's time to address fundamental issues in the American context, the common retort will always be, well, we just don't have the money to do that, to do these kinds of things. Yes, you do. Think about your priorities. What are we spending money on? That's a different kind of question. And then looks at it, he gets at the core issue. We've got our gains for the past 12 years at bargain rates. So as long as it doesn't cost white Americans anything, they're all for justice. But when justice is going to cost them their privileges, I'm sorry, they're not there. That's what the history tells you. Okay, but if it won't cost them anything, you can sign up some progressives. Now the conservatives, that's not even a conversation. But those who are marching with us, then we're like, okay, now, what are you going to do with your privilege? They're kind of like that rich man in Luke. Well, I can't do that. Cohen's book, Malcolm and Martin in America, A Dream or a Nightmare, he talks about the shattering of King's dream in chapter 8. It is an incredible essay. I like to frame the chapter as King sours on America. So he says, in the first period of King's thinking, he was trying to move society from this vision of justice within segregation, where we're separate but equal, to justice as desegregation. His idea of the beloved community, and his I Have a Dream speech, they're sort of representative of this vision, that we're going to desegregate, okay? And King is thinking of structural desegregation. All right, that's King's vision. But he begins to see that America is not interested in structural desegregation. Now, who's ever heard of the term structural desegregation? No, you haven't, because I just made it up. That's a Brogdonism. That's what when you get a PhD, you get to make up words. You get to put them things together. No, all the literature talks about desegregation. But King is thinking structurally. I mean, King believed there should be a cabinet-level position that deals with black affairs. That's in his writings. Because to him, you can't bring justice without making deeper structural changes. But all of that just gets ignored. So the second phase of his thought really represents, Cone says, the shattering of this dream. The Watts riots and other riots in northern and midwestern cities, it was an eye-opening experience for King. Because King left the South, he would start going into these cities, and King was getting pushback from blacks there. They were giving him significant pushbacks. So King starts to adjust his thinking because he's engaging with the black radical tradition, the black nationalist tradition. And he ends up writing his final book in response to that. And during this period, and you can look at a speech he delivered at Stanford, I mean, he became increasingly critical of America, saying that there are two Americas, one for the whites and then one for those who are disenfranchised. This aspect of King's thought, it gets totally ignored. King would say America is a morally sick society, and that his dream became a nightmare. He said over and over again, things are not right in this country. Why are there 40 million poor people in a nation overflowing with such unbelievable affluence? He became increasingly critical as he began to shift from issues of race to really class issues and the poverty issue. Cone believes that King adopts black separatism, that the one who pushed for integration in his later years started to say that we're not ready yet, so blacks need to stay in their own spaces. That gets ignored because King is the sort of saint of integration, of everyone being together. And is that King's vision? Yes, but everyone has a vested interest in making that happen. It can't just be the blacks. And integration has always meant you all give up everything, we give up hardly nothing, and be happy about that. King shifts from this white Jesus to a non-Western Jesus. He becomes very, very critical that all those whites, when he was the man of the year, when it was I have a dream, they loved him. Then when he starts getting down to their privilege, the story changed. And he actually adopts Malcolm's views about temporary segregation, that blacks need to pull back. Again, that gets ignored. Lycos' study of King talked about King taking a radical stance. He argued that during the last year and a half of King's life, he began to call for radical reforms, stiffening white resistance to black inequality, created a crisis in America. King would constantly say there is a moral sickness afflicting this nation that could only be remedied by radical changes. Again, a part of the history that gets ignored. So let me bring this to a close. Why is this important? Well, I just think it's problematic to make his I Have a Dream speech, particularly just the end, paradigmatic of his thought. He told the nation he had a dream. He also told the nation his dream became a nightmare. So why did we make the choice to ignore the latter and focus on the former? Why did we do that? Both messages, King's dream and the fact that his dream became a nightmare, need to be a part of our understanding of who he is and who we are. Even Obama, who I love and respect, even Obama misses this. He has this valorized, this optimistic view because he is focusing on that final excerpt of his speech and not respecting King the man who said that was superficial.
To dismiss the magnitude of this progress, to suggest, as some sometimes do, that little has changed. That dishonors the courage and the sacrifice of those who paid the price to march in those years. But we would dishonor those heroes as well, to suggest that the work of this nation is somehow complete. The arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it doesn't bend on its own. To secure the gains this country has made requires constant vigilance, not complacency. Whether by challenging those who erect new barriers to the vote, or ensuring that the scales of justice work equally for all and the criminal justice system is not simply a pipeline from underfunded schools to overcrowded jails, it requires vigilance.
So why not have a more complex understanding of who King is and bring that conversation into our national consciousness? Because to me, that's the way you honor someone, by honoring what they wrestled with, what they struggled with, and even honoring the trajectory and the development of their thought. There are just dangers of this one-sided view we have of King. Number one, it doesn't help us to make sense of the world. If you just think we're just all gonna get along and we just, and we wanna have that kumbaya moment, then you're really missing what goes on in the real world. I love the term he says, that some of the old optimism was a little superficial. He said it now must be tempered with some solid realism. I heard Reinhold Niebuhr in that. Niebuhr argued that liberals are too idealistic. So Niebuhr pushed for what he called Christian realism. That you have to have some pragmatism to your theology and to your advocacy. This one-sided view of King doesn't help us to come to grips with the magnitude of what we're really dealing with when you structure a society with 300 years of injustice and oppression. You just pretending it never happened doesn't solve it. And then lying about it happening doesn't solve it. Okay, if you're gonna try to correct and address these things, you're talking about it's substantive work that you're gonna have to do, and it's going to cost the nation billions of dollars, because that's exactly what the nation was able to build doing this. I think this one-sided view just lets us off the hook too easily. When we don't have this complex understanding of King, then we're not really owning that we're all the heirs of history. And I believe it sets current leaders up for failure and bitterness. Because what's gonna happen when the very things that created agonizing moments in King's life, what that does and what that creates when you're doing that same work? You don't have the resources to draw on to nurture you and to feed you and to help you deal with that kind of dissonance. This is some of the reasons we're having issues of clergy burnout, clergy suicide, people who are disillusioned, people who are abandoning the Christian vision of doing social justice for more secular models. Because we're not nurturing them, we're not preparing them for what they're going to really face. We don't even do it in seminary. So we got to do a better job of that, so that they know exactly what it is you're gonna confront. The New Testament writer ends, the New Testament ends with the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation gives us this image of the beast. It's a very apropos image of what it means to come up against political and social and economic systems that just enslave the masses. And behold, I saw the beast, and it stood up on the land and the sea. That is literally what we're facing. We are facing something that's apocalyptic, something that's massive. And for you to take that on in your generation, you're gonna need some deeper resources to do that. So the real question is, we need to be asking ourselves as a country on every King Day, is who and what forces in America killed this man's dream? That's what we ought to be talking about. That's right. Because that dream was beautiful.
Yes, yes.
Who killed it? What killed it? And why is that important? I also believe that King's emphasis on structural black poverty and the substantial cost required to remedy it, to me, that's a form of arguing for reparations. He doesn't need to use that language, but that's exactly what he's talking about. especially when he says, yeah, all the gains we've got with, these Civil Rights Act, desegregating things, giving us the right to vote, y'all got that stuff at bargain discounts, bargain rates. If you're going to get us off of this lonely island of poverty, then it's going to cost the nation something. That's reparation. He is calling for structural repair, a call that was completely ignored. And then when we talk about King, let's not talk about the repair. Let's talk about the dream, the end of the dream. Historically, white Americans have rejected structural desegregation. They don't want to structurally desegregate America. They want integration that means black institutions, black entities, they lose everything, and a small group are allowed into white space. So this informs a lot of the work our president is doing, of trying to raise people's awareness of what happened historically and the significant fallout in black communities all across the country. And speaking of our president, I found a very striking parallel. That in those later years, King was becoming more radical because he was engaging with black nationalists. He was willing to listen to their critiques. And his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, is a response to that. And what he shows in that book was that he was listening to them, but he also had some of his core commitments about issues of violence that he was not willing to concede. And so, I really appreciate that about Dr. King, that he's able to listen to not just, because anytime we teach a course on King, we're going to talk about who are those intellectual influences on King's thinking. We talk about the white liberal tradition, the social gospel tradition. We talk about Mays and Thurman. It's always those voices that are coming from academic spaces that's informing King's thinking. Yes, and that's important to lift that up, but King also listened to the folks on the streets.
Yes, yes.
And he allowed their perspectives and their influences to inform and to reform his theology. And I see that same kind of thing happening with our president.
Yes, yes.
That he's kind of, as he's engaging with the ADOS movement, he's getting radicalized. And I think some of that same sort of agony and self-reflection that King was going through, I think Dr. Cosby's been going through that as well. And he's starting to listen to people who are coming from a different part of the black community, and they have a different critique. And he's he's listening, and he is being responsive. So very, very striking parallel there. So it is clear structural poverty, that's the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Mass black poverty, that was King's nightmare. It's ours too.